My name is Margaret Knight. I'm 38 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I would have described my life as predictable in the best possible way. I work as a project manager for a regional construction company. My days follow a rhythm I've refined over years. Early mornings on job sites, structured afternoons of emails and coordination, home by 6. I run most evenings. I plan my weekends. I don't chase chaos. I build things that last. Or at least, I thought I did. My boyfriend, Daniel Carter, is 35. We've been together for 9 years. Not married, but everything else looked the part. Shared accounts, long-term plans, a house I bought 3 years before we moved in together. On paper, we were stable. From the outside, we made sense. Daniel had always been different from me. More restless, more expressive. He thrived in social environments, worked in marketing, surrounded himself with noise, energy, momentum. I never tried to limit that. I trusted him to move freely within something solid. I thought that balance worked. For a long time, it did. But about 8 months ago, something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It started with small comments. Casual, almost throwaway. You ever feel like we're stuck in a loop? This routine, doesn't get to you? At first, I thought he was just venting. Everyone gets restless sometimes. I didn't take it personally. Until it became personal. He stopped calling our life stable. Started calling it predictable. And not in a good way. One night at dinner, he looked at me across the table, calm, almost curious, and said something that didn't feel like a complaint. It felt like a conclusion. You know what your problem is, Margaret? I set my fork down slowly. What's that? You're too safe. Not too safe for him. Just too safe. I asked him what he meant. He leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a concept he was trying to explain. Some people actually live, he said, and some people just maintain. There was something rehearsed about the way he said it. And then he said her name. Vanessa, his ex-girlfriend from his 20s. The one I'd heard about in passing over the years. The one who, according to him, never followed rules. I didn't react immediately. I just asked the question that mattered. Are you talking to her again? He hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Yeah, he said. We reconnected. It's not a big deal. Just catching up. Catching up. He said it like it was harmless. Like nostalgia. Like running into someone from an old life and comparing notes. I asked how often they were talking. Here and there, he said, already sounding irritated. Why does it matter? I didn't raise my voice. It matters because you brought her into this conversation. That annoyed him. You're reading too much into it, he said. Not everything is a threat, Margaret. But over the next few weeks, here and there became something else. I would see him smiling at his phone, tilting the screen away when I walked past, typing quickly, then locking it like a reflex. When I asked who it was, he'd say things like, friends, work, people who aren't trying to die of boredom. That word again. Boredom. It started to feel less like a description, and more like an accusation. Then one night, he came home later than usual. He had told me earlier he was out with colleagues, drinks after work, nothing unusual. But when he walked in, there was something different about him. Not tired, not distracted, energized, almost electric. I looked up from the couch. How was the event? He didn't hesitate. It wasn't an event, he said. I met Vanessa just like that. No apology, no build-up, just a statement. I sat there for a second, letting that settle. You could have mentioned that, I said. He shrugged, dropping his keys on the counter. You would have made it weird. I wouldn't have, I said evenly, but I would have appreciated the honesty. That irritated him instantly. And see, that's exactly what I mean, he said. Everything with you has rules, transparency, structure, expectations. That's called a relationship, I replied. He laughed, not kindly. No, he said, that's called control. I let that sit between us. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Are you considering leaving? He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, like he was deciding how honest he wanted to be. And then he said it. Maybe I already have. Not physically, emotionally. And I understood something in that moment. He wasn't confessing. He was testing, waiting for a reaction. But I didn't give him one. Over the next few weeks, he stopped being subtle. Vanessa became a presence in our conversations, in comparisons, in arguments. Vanessa takes risks. Vanessa doesn't live by spreadsheets. Vanessa actually feels things. Each sentence carefully placed. Each one meant to provoke. But I stayed calm. Not because I didn't feel anything, because I was paying attention. Then one night, he came home late again. Sat across from me at the kitchen table like he was about to deliver a performance review. I've been thinking, he said. I didn't respond. I have clarity now. I nodded slightly. Go on. He leaned forward. being with Vanessa again. It reminded me what real chemistry feels like. There it was. Clean, direct. I feel desired, he continued, in a way I haven't in years. I let him finish. You're stable, Margaret. You're dependable. You're responsible. I waited, and then he said it again. You're too boring to be wanted. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Expectant. He was waiting for something. Anger, tears, a reaction. Instead, I stood up, walked to the stairs, then turned back to him. This house is in my name, I said calmly. I bought it 3 years before we moved in together. He blinked, confused. I'm not going to share it with someone who just told me they don't want me. The shift in his expression was immediate. You're not serious, he said. I am, I replied. I walked upstairs, pulled a suitcase from the closet and brought it down. Set it on the floor in front of him. You have an hour. For a second, Daniel didn't move. He just stared at the suitcase like it had appeared in the room by accident, like this was some dramatic gesture I would walk back once he challenged it. Then he laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. Margaret, come on. I said nothing. His eyes narrowed. You're overreacting. No, I said. I'm responding. That seemed to hit him harder than yelling would have. He stood up from the table, hands spread slightly, voice sharpening with irritation. So that's it? 9 years and you're throwing me out because I was honest? I looked at him steadily. You didn't just tell me you were unhappy. You told me another woman made you feel alive, then looked me in the face and said I was too boring to be wanted. You don't get to call that honesty and act surprised when it has consequences. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried a different angle. I never said I'd chosen her. You didn't have to. His jaw tightened. I could see the calculation happening in real time. He had expected pain, maybe pleading. Maybe one of those raw, late-night conversations where he got to stand in the middle of the room and measure 2 lives against each other while I tried to prove my worth. Instead, I had handed him a suitcase, and suddenly the whole thing felt less romantic for him, less like a thrilling emotional reckoning and more like what it actually was, a decision. He scoffed and dragged a hand through his hair. Couples go through rough patches, Margaret. This stopped being the rough patch when you started presenting your ex-girlfriend as an upgrade. His face darkened. You always do that. You reduce everything to bullet points, to facts, to structure. I held his gaze. Because facts matter. He gave a bitter smile. God, you really don't hear yourself. I didn't answer. He wanted me emotional because emotion would blur the lines. Emotion would make space for ambiguity, for one more conversation, one more chance for him to keep both doors open while he decided which life suited him better. I wasn't going to be an option he compared against chaos. When I didn't soften, his tone shifted again. The irritation thinned into something more defensive. So what, you're just done? I nodded once. Yes. That's cold. No, I said quietly. What's cold is sitting across from someone who built a life with you and telling her she isn't exciting enough to be loved. That landed. Not enough to change him, but enough to strip some of the self-righteousness from his posture. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked away first. Within 45 minutes, he had packed clothes, toiletries, his laptop, some shoes, a charger, and the expensive leather jacket he always reached for when he wanted to feel like a different version of himself. He moved through the house with restless, clipped motions, opening drawers harder than necessary, muttering under his breath, angry now that the scene wasn't unfolding according to whatever script he had imagined. I stayed downstairs. I did not follow him from room to room. I did not ask where he would go. I did not offer comfort for the consequences of his own choices. When he came back down with the suitcase, he paused near the front door and looked at me like he was waiting for one last intervention, one last crack. You're really doing this. I stood by the kitchen island, hands resting lightly on the edge. I'm not the one who brought another woman into this relationship. His expression hardened. You know what your problem is? You think being right is the same thing as being loving. The old me might have turned that over, examined it, wondered if maybe my steadiness had, in fact, become a kind of emotional distance. But not then. Not with Vanessa's name still warm in the air between us. Good night, Daniel. He stared at me for another second, then said, You'll regret this when you realize not everyone wants someone like you. It was such a cruel thing, so carefully chosen. A final strike aimed at the softest place. But by then, something inside me had already gone still. That's a risk I'm willing to take, I said. Then I opened the door. He walked out carrying the suitcase himself. I closed the door behind him and locked it. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was not dramatic. It was small, mechanical, precise. Still, it felt like the loudest sound in the house. I stood there for a while afterward, one hand still resting on the lock, staring at my own reflection in the dark glass. My face looked strangely composed, not numb, not broken, just clear. I slept badly, but I did sleep. And the next morning, before I left for work, I called a lawyer. Not because I was panicking, because I know how fast a messy emotional situation becomes a legal one when you give it room to drift. I explained that my boyfriend had moved out voluntarily after telling me he wanted to pursue someone else. I clarified that the house was mine before cohabitation, that our finances were partly shared, that there were no children involved. I asked what I needed to do immediately to protect myself. By lunchtime, I had opened a separate bank account in my name only. By the end of the workday, I had redirected my direct deposit, changed the passwords on our shared financial logins, removed his access from the home security app, and scheduled a formal consultation for the following morning. I did it all calmly, not because I wasn't hurting, because structure was the only thing keeping the pain from becoming chaos. Daniel texted me around noon. "Are you seriously doing all this?" No apology, no accountability, just disbelief that I had turned his emotional experiment into something real. I looked at the screen for a moment, then typed one sentence. "Yes, my attorney will be in contact." That was all. He called immediately after. I let it ring. Then came a longer message. "You're escalating this for no reason. Every relationship hits turbulence. This is exactly what I meant about you being rigid and transactional." I read it once and set the phone face down on my desk. There was something almost fascinating about it. The speed with which he shifted from contempt to criticism, from declaring me too dull to matter to accusing me of being too decisive to lose. I didn't respond. Later that evening, another message came through. "Vanessa is different in real life than I remembered." I stared at that one a little longer. Then I kept reading. "Living with her isn't what I expected. Everything is intense all the time." There it was. Not regret exactly. More like discomfort. The thrilling woman who actually lived apparently came with friction, volatility, unpredictability that stopped feeling sexy once it entered daily life and started sitting on the couch beside him. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. Because even then, even after everything he had said, his instinct was still the same. When instability stopped being theoretical, he reached back toward the stable thing. Toward me. Not with remorse. With testing. I blocked his number. Then I blocked him everywhere else. Social media, email filters, shared streaming accounts, every digital doorway he might use to slip back into my line of sight. I wasn't being dramatic. I was recognizing a pattern. He wanted freedom as long as safety remained available in the background. I wasn't going to be anyone's contingency plan. The silence after that was immediate and clean. For the next 6 weeks, I let my life narrow in the healthiest possible way. Work, home, runs in the evening, dinner with a friend once in a while, phone calls with my parents, meetings with my lawyer, paperwork, documentation, quiet. Routine returned slowly, like an animal approaching with caution. And in that quiet, I realized something uncomfortable. I missed the shape of a shared life more than I missed him. The extra coffee cup in the sink. A second set of footsteps upstairs. Someone else moving through the kitchen while I answered late emails. The architecture of companionship was still there in my body, even after trust had collapsed. But that feeling passed. Not quickly. Still, it passed. Then one evening, just as I was lacing up my running shoes, a mutual acquaintance sent me a link with no explanation. I opened it. A local news article. Vanessa Cole's name was in the headline. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bench by the door and read every word. The article wasn't vague. It wasn't gossip or rumor or some blurred social media accusation blown into a headline. It was clinical, structured, specific. Federal investigation, wire fraud, interstate financial crimes, business records, co-conspirators. I read it once, then again more carefully. This was the woman Daniel had described with that strange reverence in his voice, the woman who took risks, the woman who made life feel unpredictable and electric, the woman who, according to him, had made him remember what real chemistry felt like. Now her name was attached to a federal investigation. And suddenly that phrase he had repeated so admiringly, "She actually lives," took on a very different shape. 2 days later, a second article appeared. Arrest made. Court date scheduled. Bond hearing pending. I did not contact him. I did not ask questions. I did not look for updates beyond what was already public. There was no need. My life was already separating itself from his in every practical, legal, and emotional sense. Whatever was happening on the sharp edge he had chosen, it belonged to him now. A week after the arrest, my mother called. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something had happened. Not because she sounded panicked, because she sounded careful. Have you heard from Daniel? She asked. I straightened in my chair. No, I blocked him weeks ago. There was a brief pause. Then she said, he came here. I felt something in my chest go still. My parents live about 30 minutes away. Daniel had not spoken to them since the night he left. He had chosen his exit, chosen his new life, chosen to frame me as a woman too dull to be wanted. And now he had shown up at my parents' front door, unannounced, crying. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just held the phone a little tighter, my mind moving faster than my voice. How did he look? I asked finally. My mother exhaled softly, like she was choosing her words with care. Not like himself. That alone told me more than anything else she could have said. Your father answered the door, she continued. Daniel looked disoriented, not dramatic, not putting on a show, just off. His eyes were red, like he hadn't slept. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall across from me. What did he want? Another pause. He asked if he could come in. I closed my eyes briefly. And you let him? Yes, she said, but there was firmness in her voice. Only because your father made it clear you weren't here, and that we weren't going to be a way around you. That sounded like him. Careful, direct, no room for interpretation. What did he say? My mother hesitated, then answered quietly. He said Vanessa was arrested in front of him. The image landed immediately. Early morning. Sharp knocks on the door. Voices that don't ask for permission. The kind of presence that fills a space before anyone understands what's happening. Federal agents, she added. He said they showed up early. Took her out in handcuffs. I let out a slow breath. And he didn't know? I asked. He says he didn't, my mother replied. He said he thought her businesses were aggressive, not illegal. That word again. Aggressive. A softer version of something harder. What exactly was he asking for? I said. My mother's voice shifted slightly. That's the thing. When I asked him that directly, he struggled to answer. I almost smiled. Of course he did. He said he made a mistake, she continued. That he misjudged her. That he got caught up in nostalgia and ego. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window, watching the quiet street outside. He said he thought he wanted unpredictability, she added, but he didn't expect federal charges and agents at 6 a.m. I rested my hand against the glass. And then? I asked. My mother lowered her voice. He asked if you hated him. That was the part that made something in me tighten. Not because of the question itself, because of what it implied. Hate suggests intensity, emotion, attachment. Hate means you still exist at the center of someone's world. What I felt wasn't hate. It was clarity. What did Dad say? I asked. He told him he couldn't speak for you, she said, that you handled everything decisively, and that he should assume you meant what you did. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Did he ask to come back here? I asked. Yes, she said. He asked if he could come talk to you. At the house. And? We said no. There was no hesitation in her voice this time. Your father told him if he needed to communicate, he could do it through proper channels. That showing up at our door wasn't appropriate. Good. That was exactly right. What happened then? He cried, she said simply. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet. The kind of crying that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that happens when something finally settles in. My mother went on. I gave him water. Let him sit for a while, maybe 20 minutes. Then your father asked him again, what exactly are you asking for? And he said he didn't know. That was the most honest thing he'd said so far. He said he made a mistake, she repeated. That he confused chaos with passion. That he thought you would fight for him. That last line lingered. I let it sit in the silence between us. And when you didn't, my mother added quietly, he said he doubled down, out of pride. There it was. Not love. Not conviction. Pride. And now? I asked. He said when everything happened, when Vanessa was arrested, the first person he wanted to call was you. I closed my eyes again. Not because he loved her less, she continued. Because he trusted you more. That line landed deeper than the rest. Trust. Something steady, predictable, reliable. Everything he had framed as boring. What did you tell him? I asked. I didn't answer that, she said. That's not my place. Good. Then your father told him to leave, she added. Politely, but clearly. I nodded again. And Margaret, she said more softly. He asked if he could come back another time. And? We told him no. I exhaled slowly. Thank you. There was a pause on the line. What do you want us to do if he shows up again? She asked. Don't let him in, I said immediately. Not because I'm angry, because boundaries only work if they're consistent. I understand, she said. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, not replaying the relationship, not questioning my decision, just observing the pattern. He had wanted something unpredictable. something intense, something that made him feel like anything could happen. Now something had happened. And the first place he went wasn't toward that chaos. It was back toward structure, back toward safety, back toward me. That night, I emailed my attorney to confirm something. The divorce filing had already been submitted. The petition had been served. There was no informal path backward unless I chose one. I had no intention of doing that. 10 days later, my attorney forwarded me a message from Daniel's legal representation. The tone had changed. No arguments, no attempts to contest anything, just careful language. They were asking about temporary financial support, framed as hardship, transitional assistance. I read it twice. There was no denial of what had happened, no attempt to rewrite the narrative, just an implied suggestion that given the circumstances, perhaps I might reconsider the terms. Circumstances, meaning Vanessa's arrest, meaning the collapse of the life he had chosen over ours. My attorney called me that afternoon. "Do you want to pause proceedings?" he asked directly. "No," I said. There was no hesitation. "Do I have any legal obligation to support him beyond asset division?" "No," he replied. "You both work. There are no children. The cohabitation period doesn't automatically trigger long-term support, especially given that he left voluntarily." "That's all I needed," I said. Later that week, an email appeared in a filtered folder I had set up. A new address. Daniel. It bypassed the block, but it didn't bypass the system I had put in place. I opened it. The tone was different, quieter. He said he was staying with a friend, that the investigation around Vanessa was worse than he thought, that assets were frozen, that people connected to her were being questioned. He claimed he had no involvement, but he was being pulled into interviews. Proximity. Guilt by association. He wrote that he never expected things to escalate like this, that he confused chaos with chemistry, that he mistook volatility for passion. Then one line stood out. "You were never boring. You were safe. I just didn't appreciate it." I read that sentence twice. Then I forwarded the email to my attorney and did not reply, because appreciation that arrives after collapse isn't insight. It's consequence. A few days later, I heard through a mutual contact that Vanessa was being held without bond. The charges were serious, not a misunderstanding, not a temporary scare, something real, something lasting. And still, I felt nothing close to satisfaction. Just confirmation. A month passed. Paperwork moved forward. Financial disclosures. Account balances. Itemized assets. No arguments over furniture. No emotional negotiations. Everything clean. Procedural. Then my mother called again. "He left something in our mailbox," she said. "What?" "A letter. Handwritten." I was quiet for a second. "Did you open it?" "No," she said. "Your father thought you should decide." "Bring it to me," I said. That evening, she did. Folded paper, no envelope. I sat at my kitchen table and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was his, less controlled than usual. The words weren't polished like the email. They were raw. He wrote that he had confused adrenaline with love, that he thought leaving would force me to fight for him, that when I didn't, he pushed further, out of pride. He admitted he liked provoking reactions, that he mistook my calm for indifference, that when everything fell apart, the first person he trusted wasn't the woman he chose. It was me. He ended it simply. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to talk." I stared at that last line for a long time. Then I folded the paper back along the original crease and placed it in a drawer, right next to the divorce paperwork. Some conversations aren't about closure. They're about reopening doors. And I wasn't a door anymore. 2 weeks after the letter, my attorney sent me a brief update. Daniel had formally responded to the divorce petition. He wasn't contesting it. No delays, no objections, no attempt to negotiate terms beyond what had already been outlined. Just acceptance. That told me more than anything he had written. Either his attorney had made it clear there was nothing to gain by fighting, or he had finally understood something simple. I was not reconsidering. Around the same time, another update surfaced about Vanessa. Additional charges. Expanded financial records. The scale of what she had been involved in was larger than the initial report suggested. Not just risky ventures or failed businesses, structured fraud, multiple states, coordinated activity. I read the article once, then I closed it. There was no sense in revisiting it. The version of her that had existed in Daniel's mind, the one who actually lived, the one who made everything feel electric, had been replaced by something far more precise. Documentation, evidence, consequences. A few days later, another email came through from Daniel. Shorter this time. More measured. He said he had moved into a small apartment, that the interviews with investigators were still ongoing, but he was not a target. that he was trying to rebuild quietly. He wrote that he understood why I cut contact, that he had mistaken stability for stagnation and arrogance for confidence. Then he asked one final question. If none of this had happened, would you have fought for me? I sat with that for exactly 1 minute. Not longer. Because the answer wasn't complicated. It never had been. I opened a reply window, typed one sentence. If none of this had happened, you would still believe I was too boring to be wanted. I didn't add anything else. No explanation. No softness. No attempt to educate him on what he had lost. Just the truth. I sent it. That was the only direct response I gave him after everything. And it felt complete. A week later, the divorce was finalized. No courtroom, no speeches, no dramatic final confrontation. Just documents, signatures, a stamp. 9 years of shared life reduced to paper and ink. The house remained mine. The accounts were divided cleanly. No lingering financial ties. No obligations. For the first time since that night at the kitchen table, everything felt quiet again. Not the fragile quiet of avoidance. The kind that settles after something has ended fully. It has been 4 months since the divorce was finalized. Marcus, Vanessa's case, moved quickly after that. A plea agreement. Reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. The details stopped making headlines. But consequences don't disappear just because attention does. They just become private. Daniel sent one last message through his attorney. Not about money. Not about assets. Just a short note. He asked if I would ever be open to coffee. No expectations. Just a conversation between two people who used to share a life. I read it once. Then I closed the file. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Because closure is not a social event. When he left, he framed me as something lacking. When he came back, he framed himself as mistaken. Both versions centered his experience. What never changed was the decision underneath it. He equated volatility with value. He saw steadiness as a flaw. That belief didn't appear overnight. And it didn't disappear just because volatility came with handcuffs and early morning arrests. People often assume that the person who stays calm feels less. That if you don't beg, you don't care. That if you don't fight, you didn't love. That isn't true. I cared enough to remove myself from a situation where I was being compared like an option. I cared enough to refuse the role of a backup plan. I cared enough to end something the moment respect was replaced with contempt. Being called boring didn't end the relationship. Contempt did. The moment someone looks at you and sees stability as weakness, the foundation is already gone. The house is still quiet now. My routine hasn't changed. Work, evenings, runs, weekends with friends. The same rhythm. The same structure. The difference is, there's no one sitting across from me, measuring my worth against chaos. He wanted something unpredictable. Something that made him feel like anything could happen. I wanted something that could last. Only one of those survives consequences. That's the whole story.